Everyone, please find your seats. We're going to get started. And then I'll call you up. Okay, so we have President Mahmoud. Oh, sorry. In the right. All right, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us through our scheduling hiccups this morning. It's sometimes hard to get everything to fit properly in the schedules, but I do appreciate it. It's kind of surreal that we're on the final day of the conference already. It really does fly. I'm really excited about this next panel because this is a panel very relevant and important that is facing our world right now. So the international climate negotiations, the Conference of the Parties, COP21 in Paris are happening this December, and they represent a massive opportunity for action and for change. And this panel is going to explore what happens in those negotiations, why they're important, what success might look like, what barriers might look like, how we can potentially get involved in that process. We have such an amazing panel of distinguished speakers this morning that I feel we're very privileged to have this amount of knowledge on these negotiations from such a various different viewpoints in presence. So I'm going to ask our speakers to come to the stage, and I'm going to read out their names as we have them up. So I have Mr. Harrison Alvarez, the Commissioner of the Climate Change Commission of the Philippines. Michael Schellenberger, President of the Breakthrough Institute. Ralph Sims, Professor of Sustainable Energy at Massey University in New Zealand. Howard Bamsey, Adjunct Professor, Regulatory Institutions Network at Australian National University. As we all heard from last night, President Mamoun Abdul Gayoom, the former president of the Maldives, who gave us a very good timing already on this topic. All right, so for this panel, we decided that a discussion was going to be a little bit more effective than formal presentations. And so the way that we're going to run this is we have 5-minute introductory speeches or comments from each of our panelists. And I've asked them to kind of frame it around what are these negotiations, why do they matter, what would you like to see out of them, what are some potential barriers, and what are some potential opportunities. And then we're going to engage in a broader conversation as a group, and we're going to be using the Pigeonhole extensively in this session. So please use it, as well as we'll take questions from the mic. And this will be our opportunity to explore what's going to happen in Paris this December and how we can all play a part in it. So to provide a little opening context, although I am in nowhere the authority. We have the authorities up here. The reason this is important and the reason this really matters to the world is that the climate processes have been kind of riddled with challenge since COP15 in Copenhagen. And so this represents an opportunity to, as a global community, come together and hopefully work out a plan that is inclusive of the entire globe. And so we're going to hear from each of our panelists now, starting with Mr. Harrison Alvarez, the opening comments about the climate negotiations.
Thank you so much, Kiwi, au Canada. After 23 years of negotiation and debates on climate change, the world finally stands at a hopeful crossroad. The world is on the brink of creating a new international order, one that will reduce carbon poison in the atmosphere and guarantee a better future for our civilization. The Philippines is one of the top 3 countries most vulnerable to climate impacts. So we are enthusiastic about the coming Paris conference. In Paris this December, world leaders are expected to see a pact that would curb greenhouse gas emissions and limit global warming to exceed 2 degrees Celsius over 2 decades, above that of pre-industrial levels. Beyond this point, the international scientific community believes we will lose our ability to prevent the worst impact of climate change. We will need to ensure the success of the Paris Summit, but the pivotal countries in these efforts would be the United States, China, the Russian Federation, India, and Japan. They are in a position to seriously influence the other large emitters, Brazil, Germany, and Indonesia. In 2014, these 8 countries alone accounted for almost 6% of global carbon emissions. This week, the 67 group of industrial nations meeting in Germany reaffirmed the century. A globally binding agreement is not only possible, it is imperative. Another Kyoto situation will only be a failure. Majority of world leaders are now deeply aware that the world has run out of options and we're also running out of time. With the US, China, France, and Germany leading the nations, a comprehensive climate agreement can begin a workable global mitigation program. And the single most important outcome of the Paris Summit would come in the submission of intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs, by all nations. INDCs will form the main input to the Paris Climate Conference. Since aggregate INDCs will determine whether the world can truly unite within a brief span of time towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient future. Most of the member states are currently working on their national pre-2020 INDCs, 5 years from 2015 after Paris, to be submitted in the coming months, well before the Paris Conference of December. More than 2 decades of negotiations has created a lot of skepticism, and it is legitimate to ask what will make COP21 different from other past conferences of humanity. The difference is that there is now a broad scientific consensus. In fact, a universal fear among nations that climate change is the greatest threat to human survival. Last March, scientists have provided increasingly more compelling evidence that the safe level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has reached a dangerous and alarming 400 parts per million, while the assumed safe threshold is 350 parts per million. This is a very clear signal that nations must act swiftly to protect our planet. But even the great nations of the world are bound to market practices and traditions held for decades, and change does not come easy. It is the young minds of the world, you. Since time immemorial, the youth have readily embraced change from a status quo. This is status quo mindset of carbon efficiency and the widespread fallacy that is the cheap fuel, abundant fuel of our modernized community. Carbon is never cheap. Corporate man has excluded from its cause the human death and social ruin, even the death of species, and the destruction of biodiversity from its market cost. Toward the end of the 18th century, Paris has confronted an enormous historic challenge that brought a great human drama of change, the French Revolution. Although it was violent, it is perhaps the most universally significant political and social revolution that gave humanity the eternal cry for liberté, equality, and fraternity. But today, even before we moved to Paris, even before you moved to Paris, perhaps some years thereafter even, let you, the youth of our nations, swiftly and resoundingly challenge the gridlock of 400 billion fossil fuel subsidy and the market cost of externalities of carbon. The peaceful global battle cry of man to save man from climate change would be liberté, égalité, nunca externality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Harrison. I think the Philippines has been unwavering in their commitment to battling climate change, and I'll never forget at the summit in Qatar, watching on the final day of screens, the representative from the Philippines said, "If not us, then who? If not here, then where? If not now, then when?" And I think those comments really struck at the importance of taking action now. So thank you so much for those. Next up, we have Michael Schellenberger. I'll invite him to the podium. Thank you, Michael.
Great, thank you again, Kelly, and thank you again to the organizers of the conference. I just want to, maybe everyone would just join me again, a round of applause, thanking the conference organizers for their great work. I guess I wanted to start just by apologizing that I'm not a woman. When you look at my fellow panelists, I think you could agree that there's something missing. I can't do anything about that right now, but next year I'd be happy to bring some of my female colleagues and bring some more gender diversity here. I think it's important to understand the climate negotiations in the context of energy transitions and national economic development. So we talked yesterday about how for the last 100 years, countries have already been moving to cleaner sources of energy. They go from wood, which is the dirtiest form of energy. It kills 4 million people a year just on the toxic smoke. That's not counting the back-breaking labor of hauling wood and being reliant entirely on your own body to move things around. But also we go from coal to natural gas. We went from coal to oil, from gas and oil to nuclear and renewables. And that process has been happening without regard to climate change, and in most cases it's been happening without regard to the environment. Energy and food production are the two main drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. We focus a lot on energy, but keep in mind that land use changes, removing forests, and other associated changes are some of the biggest drivers of greenhouse gas emissions. Energy and food production are national security questions. In every country has its own unique geography and its own unique economic and security considerations. And so when you look around the world, you can see those broad patterns of energy transitions, but you also see highly specific choices that countries make based on their national land and energy assets. So for example, Brazil is its electric sector is overwhelmingly from hydroelectric dams. The reason for that is it has huge rivers and very few fossil assets. France and Sweden also lack coal and other fossil energy, and after the OPEC oil embargo, they moved to nuclear and hydroelectricity. France gets about 75% of its electricity from nuclear, Sweden gets about 50%, and the rest from hydro. And sub-Saharan Africa is likely to skip past coal not because it wouldn't use the coal if it had it, because it lacks it and instead has abundant natural gas reserves. And even in countries that will be most affected by climate change, such as the Maldives, I had a nice conversation with the president a few months ago, and he explained why the Maldives is so reliant on burning oil for electricity. Even though oil is actually, burning oil is one of the most expensive ways to generate electricity, it's the best that the Maldives can do, even though it, more than anyone else, recognizes the threat posed by climate change. What do those cases teach us? What it teaches is that nations have to make very specific choices about how it uses its energy and land resources, and there's simply no nation in the world that is going to delegate those decisions to an international body. It doesn't matter what anybody says. Some people make commitments. They might say, in 2100, this will happen, and these commitments, I would note, usually will be met or not met when the politicians are out of office and usually dead. So when you think about the international climate negotiations, you have to consider it in that fundamental context. So we've spent 20 years having international talks. We've got many, many promises and commitments and pledges and all sorts of stories that countries have told, but basically countries make their choices on those economic and national security interests. Now, rich countries also decide to curb their pollution, and they should. As they get wealthier, you see the United States and Europe move to cleaner sources of energy, paying a bit more for them. And now you see China, with its awareness raised by this incredible documentary film, Under the Dome, about what it's like to live under the haze of pollution in Beijing. You see that China is making a big push in natural gas and into nuclear. So what do we take from that? I think what we take from it is that there will be no binding treaty for nations to agree to have their energy and land use decisions controlled by the United Nations. What we're going to see is countries continue to make promises, and I think in that sense it's been moving in a positive direction. Countries are going to make more specific promises, not just about what future emissions are going to be, but what they're going to do right now to accelerate technological change and technological development that will lead to lower emissions in the future. So I would just point to two, I think, important things over the last year. The first is an agreement by the United States and China to work together to accelerate the development of clean energy sources from solar to nuclear, as well as an agreement between the United States and India to work together on nuclear. I think India has said very clearly it's not going to sacrifice its economic development, it's not going to keep people in a wood economy for the sake of climate change, but India does have a significant scientific and technical capacity and national commitment to climate change, enough so that it will continue to make those bilateral agreements on technological change. So with that, I have an optimistic view, but it's an optimistic view not for sort of binding treaty on emissions, but for accelerated global action on technology. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. I think that really underscored tension between a global problem and national interests and trying to drive for solutions in there. Next, we have an old friend of ISIS. Ralph has been to 3 summits. I think he's our only speaker that's been to that many summits. I think that deserves a round of applause. So Ralph is going to give his thoughts. Ralph, do you want me to give you your bio, or do you want to talk a little bit about
No.
you?
No,
Okay,
just get on
it's
with it.
it's in the program. But Ralph comes from climate change on various different lenses.
Thanks, Kelly, and it's great to be back. Selamat Pagi, I've been practicing. This is my 3rd event. I go around saying to people, the other 2 were just like this. I've been to hundreds of events, and these are the best events that I've ever been to. Just the sheer enthusiasm, it really is special. So, and I came here from Tokyo, from an APERC meeting, Asia Pacific Energy Research Center, and they paid for my flight here, and I'm going to Manila to the Asian Development Bank, and they're paying for my flight there, so I haven't cost anything to ISIS either, so that's a good thing. But the reason I'm telling you that is because I do have a forest in New Zealand. I've got 200 acres, 80 hectares of a Kyoto forest, I've got certified 13,234 tonnes of credits from the New Zealand government, and I'm in surplus, even though that I spend a lot of time in aeroplanes. So if anybody wants to buy credits over the lunch break, come and see me, and we can do a deal, because I'm carbon neutral. I'll give you a quick message here from the IPCC that I've been closely involved with for years. And a key message that came out of the fifth assessment report is the carbon budget. And I don't know if we mentioned it this week, but effectively, in round figures, over the last 150 years, we've released 2,000 gigatons, billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere that are still there. At the rate we're going now, we're going to release another 3,000 or 4,000 by the end of this century, which will take us to a 4-degree, 5-degree future, which is totally unacceptable. If we want to maintain a 2-degree centigrade future that Commissioner just mentioned, that's the target to do, we can only dig up coal, oil and gas and release another 1,000 gigatons into the atmosphere, which means 2 tonnes per person per year on average over this century. And that's a huge ask. So we've got to be very clever, and we've got to make the transition very rapid. So we've released 2,000 tonnes. We've only got another 1,000 tonnes we can afford to release. The COP 2009 Copenhagen was a disappointing meeting. It was agreed that there was a 2-degree centigrade target, but there wasn't much development on the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol now is continuing to phase 2 after some deliberations. Only 13% of the world's greenhouse gases are covered under the Kyoto Protocol. So that's why it's not going to deliver, and that's why we're looking for something else in Paris. Since then, since Copenhagen, heading towards Paris, I've got a few things here to list out. The price of renewables has dropped. We've heard about that this week. And the shares of electricity, heat and biofuel have all increased for the renewable energy. So that's a trend that's happening. Consumers care more about climate change than they did in 2009. There's a much greater awareness. Investors are divesting away from fossil fuel companies, from coal companies, the pension funds, the universities, Norway. And so that's a big change. Cities are driving sustainability. We had an excellent session yesterday. I'm very closely involved with sustainable cities through the Global Environment Facility that I work for a large portion of my time. Businesses are doing a lot. A report from Ecofis just last week showed that they're responsible for 1 to 3 gigatons of CO2 reduction in total, which is tremendous. That's without having international agreements or anything. So saving the planet is good for business is the thing from there. So that's all good stuff. The other point that's driving Paris talks are the co-benefits of climate change. We're beginning to realise that climate change mitigation can be a co-benefit of improved health and less transport congestion and all sorts of other co-benefits that we get at the same time. Political developments, I'll just move on to that because this is happening as we speak. And Michael's already mentioned the US-China bilateral, which discussions have been going on for more than a year. And when the two presidents got together, Obama and Xi Jinping, then that's made the difference. And that's being pushed. That's half the greenhouse gases of the world in those discussions. G7 just met last week, and they're seeking an illegal agreement in Paris. They announced through Angela Merkel. There's good timing there for the Bonn conference, which just finished on Friday, leading up to Paris. And it seems from that, maybe Howard's going to talk a bit more about this, but there seems to be a legal agreement that's been accepted from this most recent meeting. 6 European Union oil and gas companies together called for global carbon price coming out of Paris. It's the oil and gas companies that are doing this. That's a big change. Michael just mentioned food, which reminded him that food security is high on everybody's list, including water and land use. And the whole food supply chain consumes 32% of end-use energy. This is some work I did with the FAO, the United Nations Food Agricultural Organization, and 22% of greenhouse gases. So food has got an important part in our lives, and we've got to maintain that as well. And the other point I've made here is that UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon met with, of all people, who was it? The Pope, just a few weeks ago, and they put out a joint communication on how important climate change is. So all of those are happening. I've got one more minute, and I want to just mention the INDCs, which are the Independent Nationally Determined Contributions, which even if you're an English speaker is a big mouthful. There's 12 countries already released their INDCs, what they're going to do after 2020 to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and to improve on adaptation. That's the USA, Switzerland, Russia, Norway, Morocco, Liechtenstein. I don't think there's anybody here from there. The Gabon in Africa, the EU 28 countries, Ethiopia and Canada. And for Kaylee's and Rose's knowledge, 30% reduction of 2005 levels by 2030 is the Canadian target, which isn't bad. It's about 17% below 1990. We need 40% below 1990, but at least we're getting there. And Mexico, interestingly, because I know there's people from Mexico here, 25% reduction by 2030. But very, very interestingly, I'm just writing a report on black carbon at the moment, which is a short-lived climate force, and Mexico has got a minus 51% in their black carbon emission reductions in their INDC. Why minus 51 as opposed to minus 50, I'm not sure. Indonesia, my last statement, I'll read this from the because it's a bit of a worry. This was from Wednesday. The Minister this morning mentioned the 35% renewables by 2030 and building a centre of excellence for renewable energy, and it's very positive. But the Vice President, Yusuf Kala, he promised to build more renewable energy-based power plants from hydro, solar to wind to ensure that the environment was protected, but he cautioned that the plan might only be achievable in the long run. At the moment, he argued, the government had no choice but to develop coal-fired power plants. And that's a bit of a worry. I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Ralph. Putting some numbers to the negotiations and kind of quantifying those big reductions that need to happen. Next, we have Howard Dempsey, and Howard is an adjunct professor at Regulatory Institutions Network at ANU, but he mentioned to me before he's coming at this as from a long history of negotiation experience.
Yes, thanks very much, Kaylee. My perspective is as a former negotiator, so I will focus on the negotiating process itself. But first to say, it's truly a great privilege to be here among, as Ralph said, such enthusiastic, knowledgeable, and potentially world-changing group of people. So thank you for inviting me. One point to make about the UN negotiation before I start really, which isn't reflected in media reporting. That is that the negotiations don't so much drive change as reflect countries' willingness to change. So I think that's an important framing point to make, that what you're looking at in Paris is not the prospect of something coming out of the blue, something that's unforeseen, that nobody has considered being put on table and countries being told that's what you're going to do. This is essentially now a process in which countries come together, and as Ralph mentioned, in their INDCs they say what they're going to do and then frame all of that collective effort. So it's a process that reflects what countries are willing to do rather than something top-down telling them what they're going to do. Like other speakers, I'm optimistic about the Paris meeting to the extent that I think there will be an agreement. I'm not sure that we'll finalise the legal form of that agreement during a meeting, but you never know, because the meetings are always go on a day or 2 days longer than they're supposed to. So it could well be that we have the agreement which will seal all of the commitments that countries make and that will be clear about its legal form. That agreement will be formed on the basis that was agreed here in this very convention centre 8 years ago. That basis, the key point really is that all countries will take part in both mitigation and adaptation efforts. That was new and was really set up here in Bali. That it's taken 8 years to get there, I think will underline another key point about the negotiations, and that is that though they make progress, that progress is very slow, and given the urgency of the task, particularly for countries represented on this panel and for Indonesia, given the urgency of the task, it's too slow. Why is that, and what can change the pace of the negotiating process? What can provide more confidence and begin to make of the negotiations the sort of thing that I think most people here today would want to see? Well, one of the problems we have is that there are many inbuilt barriers and obstacles in the way the process is set up. One of them, which people talk about a lot, is the need for consensus on all decisions. So there's no voting in this process. Everybody effectively has to agree before any decision can be made. Personally, I don't see that as a flaw. I think something that everybody was agitated about 20 years ago, but very few negotiators or governments now would want to change, because it's a good thing that everybody comes along with decisions on it for an issue like this, on which universal collaboration is needed. There are many other, though, systematic laws in this process compared with other UN processes. I haven't got time to go through those now, but I'm happy in the rest of the discussion or afterwards to talk about them a little. But they include the venue for the discussions in a city where there are no established diplomatic missions, so that if people want to talk about the climate change negotiations on a day-to-day basis, they have to get on planes and go somewhere else to do it. The demographic problems, if we can call them that, of having the negotiations mostly handled by foreign ministries and environment ministries that typically have very little influence on economic decision-making in their home countries. And as we know, the response to climate change is essentially about economic decision-making focused on domestic activity. So that's a big problem. There are other problems of that sort, but by far, in my opinion, by far the biggest problem is this, that the response to climate change has been, since the very beginning of negotiations, framed exclusively as costly, difficult, and burdensome for countries. And the debate has therefore been about how to share that burden. Now let me say quickly that how to share the burden is a very important part of the process. You all know the reason. Developing countries didn't cause the problem, so the costs should not fall on them when they still have a development task to do. They're very important points. And I'm now more optimistic about how to resolve that particular issue, the equity issue, than I was previously, because we have a bargain that was done in Copenhagen in 2009 about financing change in the developing world, and that bargain is by and large being fulfilled. So that's a good thing. But it doesn't change the basic frame problem that if we see the response to climate change as solely one of incurring costs that has to be shared, then the progress in negotiations reflecting the willingness of governments to change is going to continue to be too slow. And it's a mistake, in my opinion, to continue to see the response to climate change as simply cost. In the last few days, we've been talking here about opportunities that would provide benefits for those who are responding to climate change at an individual level and at a national level. If you want to know more about the national level side of that, just Google Stern Review, Gunno Report, or most recently the New Climate Economy, a commission presided over by the former President of Mexico, Felipe Calderon, and including Sri Mulyani, for example, and other notable economists, which produced a report last year that will give, I think, great confidence that countries can face the transitions that Michael and others have been talking about with optimism and confidence that they can deliver prosperity at the same time as responding very effectively to climate change. So there isn't a choice that countries have to make between the environment and the economy. That's a false choice. It no longer is the case, if ever was. You can meet the environmental needs of your country and the globe and at the same time become more prosperous and see economic development continue. If you wonder whether countries are beginning to see the world through that light, then look at the Ethiopian INDC that Raoul mentioned that was published this week. And you'll see there a very cogent, I think, very cogent reflection of Ethiopia's commitment to what I call green growth. You can use another term, even sustainable development will do. But this is a picture of a country which wants to become developed and respond very effectively to climate change. In the previous session, Rosie talked about her task as being to educate people in China, where she now is, that they can go green and save money at the same time. I'm talking about the same sort of thing at a macro scale. This is not, though, going to have an impact on the negotiations overnight. There will be more INDCs, like Ethiopia's, which show that countries are increasingly confident that they can grow and respond to climate change at the same time, but it will take a while. So there's still time for you to show those opportunities to your governments and your negotiators and to persuade them that they can be real ones, real opportunities, that they can assist the development task of your countries and they can also deliver a response to climate change that is fully effective and saves the planet.
Thank you so much for that, Howard. I think a paradigm shift and looking at this differently could make a big difference. Thank you for that. Next, we have more comments from President Gayoom, who I have to say has been so engaged with all you students. It's really a pleasure to see, and I think he is a true leader who believes in the power of the youth. So some comments from President Gayoom. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Good morning, everybody. First of all, let me thank Kelly for inviting me to be on this panel. And I would also like to thank my colleagues on the panel for the important contribution they have already made to this discussion. Let me tell you my experience with climate change negotiations or debate. I spoke about this, first of all, in Vancouver in 1987 at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. At that meeting, I spoke about global warming and sea level rise, which are major components of climate change. To my surprise, I found that many of the leaders present at that meeting had never heard about global warming. In fact, one key prime minister told my ambassador at the United Nations later that the first time that he or she had heard about global warming was when your president, meaning me, spoke about it at the Vancouver summit. But we have come a long way from that, from those days. Now everybody knows about global warming, about sea level rise, about climate change. I can tell you that climate change is not a myth. It's not a fallacy. It's a reality. It's here. We feel it every day. Let me tell you one example. During the tsunami of 2004, maybe the tsunami is not directly linked to climate change, but still it shows the vulnerability of Maldives and such low-lying island states. The tsunami wiped out 62% of our GDP in 1 hour. 62% of our GDP in 1 hour. Why? Because we are such a low-lying island country. Our land rises about 6 feet above mean sea level. A very small difference between sea level and the level of the land. So if there is any rise in sea levels, there will be a great threat to my country. During the tsunami, we felt it. A lot of infrastructure was destroyed. Our airport was suspended for several days. Resort islands were damaged. We had to spend a lot of money to recover these things. So, climate change is a reality. We have to face it. Before we go to Paris, I think we have to accept a few facts. One of the things is that climate change will affect everybody on the globe, on this planet Earth. It will not be felt only by the Maldives and low-lying island countries or low-lying regions of the world. It will be felt by everybody on this Earth. Whether you live in the coastal areas or on the mountains or in valleys or in deserts, wherever you may be, you yourself and your family and your loved ones will feel the effects of climate change sooner or later. So it makes common sense that we deal with it right now and not wait till it happens. Another point that we have to agree on, I think, is that action now will be economically and commercially more viable than acting later. Acting later will be more costly than it is now. And another thing is that even if we do take action now, the positive effects of that action will be seen after 2 or 3 decades. Meaning that if we do take action in 2015 or 2016, the positive effects will be seen by us in mid-21st century, in 2040, 2050, something like that. So there is no sense in delaying any action. The third point I want to make is that mitigation is more important than adaptation. Mitigation meaning that we treat the root cause, which is greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions that have been produced by the industrial countries and developed countries and all other countries maybe, since the Industrial Revolution have led to the present situation. So the only way that we can save this planet, our Earth, is to cut down drastically on greenhouse gas emissions. Talking about adaptation is not sensible, not wise, not good, because that means that we are trying to adapt ourselves to protect ourselves, our countries, our infrastructure from climate change, from sea level rise, from global warming. Just I'll give you an example. Male, the capital island of the Maldives, is a very low-lying island. In order to protect that island from expected sea level rise, we built a seawall around Male. The seawall cost us over $60 million. That is one island. If we want to protect 1,190 islands of the Maldives archipelago, to do the arithmetic, multiply 60 million by 1,190. We'll get a huge amount of money, billions and millions and billions of dollars. That money we don't have. That money we can't get from the outside. So there is no meaning of talking about adaptation and building seawalls, raising your land, whatever. So the real solution will be found in mitigation, which is cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions by everybody, including all countries of the world. Another thing I want to say is that we must have political will at the highest level to achieve anything. Because in Paris, we'll be represented by our ambassadors, by our ministers, by our delegates. They must agree on something. That will not happen, that will not be made effective unless their prime ministers, their presidents, and their kings endorse it. So there must be political will at the highest level in order that Paris may produce anything. So I think these are things that we have to consider. We just don't want to talk and talk and talk. We want to take action. It is already too late. It is already too late because I have been in this dialogue for the past 20 years. I know I have attended so many conferences, spoken at so many conferences, listened to so many speeches, but nothing has happened. So my position and that of the Maldives and AOS, small island states, is that we must do something to cut down on greenhouse gas emissions in Paris. Otherwise, there is nothing that will save us in the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Qayyum. I think that really shows that we all are going to be affected by climate change. If only right now certain areas are really feeling the effects, that will be the case globally, and mitigation is the way we need to go in order to tackle that. So now we're going to open up for dialogue. So we're going to go into a discussion here. I'm going to take questions from the pigeonhole, but first I have my own question, selfishly, and it's addressed to anyone in the panel who wants to take it to start. But what makes COP21 in Paris different from other past climate conferences, or is it different? Anyone want to tackle that one? Would you like to hear yours?
What makes
It's good.
okay? What makes Paris a potentially successful human endeavor? Is that a question?
Yes.
Well, of course, humanity has done its homework. The science evidence is now the mainstream thinking. I don't think any scientist of good repute will oppose the reports of IPCC, especially the periodic report. They're well studied. And of course, because they're well studied and the political leaders are now thinking scientific, politicians like myself hardly believe science sometimes, but this time science gives us a very compelling picture of the danger. If we don't diminish the 3,100 billion metric tons of carbon in the atmosphere, then we will reach a point of overheating the Earth. We're already overheating the Earth, where humanity, with all its ingenuity, may not be able to hold back the overheating. And the political leaders are now concerned. if they're not afraid. That's why I think Paris will be a successful common endeavor. We were confronted with a similar danger during the nuclear holocaust. And I think our leaders then were confronted with the danger of reducing the world into nuclear cinders, burning all of us. And we came to agreement, somehow a tentative agreement. What this young fellow says, that we must bring this agreement to specifics, we can work that out. Because the initial submission of country participation begins in December, and we have about 5 years continually perfecting how to make this enforceable. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Howard, comments on how this is different or if it's different from other summits?
I think it's different in many ways. Each meeting is different from all the others. This one, I think, a couple of things that are important, and probably they come down to the expectations of the meeting and the reality being closer than usual. Quite often, and Copenhagen is the best known example, expectations and reality are very different. But I think the process of countries producing their commitments before the meeting means that by the time we get to Paris, we'll be much clearer about and much more settled and less anxious in a way, that I'm talking about the negotiators here, about the outcome than is usual. So I think we can expect that it'll be a steadier process in Paris, and thus potentially a more positive tone to discussions, and that might encourage countries to do even more than they expect they're going to.
Great. Ross, do you have a comment?
Yes, if I just make a short comment. As I said before, and as Michael said, the United States and China both coming to the table with predetermined targets is a huge difference to anything that's happened before, and I think that's going to make a big impact. And the cities and the private sector are both putting pressure on national governments too, and that's far, far more than what has been the case in the past.
President Gayam, do you think there are any countries in particular that need to step up at this summit, or is it everyone?
I think everyone should play their part. But of course, when you come to think about what happened in the earlier COPs and the decisions taken and the positions taken by various governments, you have to agree that the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, India, China, and Brazil, these are very important countries which will have to take a very good stand in order that any agreement that is produced by Paris can be implemented and will make change in our future.
Great. Michael, given your comment on national interests and kind of a global problem, and the question just previous about which countries need to step up, do you think that the big players will be able to do that? And do you think the indication of the agreement is between China and the U.S. is positive and moving in that direction?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the change happened in Copenhagen when we realized it wouldn't be binding emission, that it was going to be pledges, and then there was this move to more focus on more specific actions. So I mean, I think I basically agree with my fellow panelists on that.
Great, thank you. All right, let's go to Pigeonhole. As well, if anyone would like to go to the mics, I'm going to take questions there after this question. So the first question from Pigeonhole, with 23 votes, so lots of people are wanting to hear about this one. Why should developing countries participate in climate change negotiations when developed countries have achieved their developed status by destroying the environment? Anyone like to start with that one? Why should developing countries participate in climate change negotiations? Want to start with this one?
I started that one. I come from a developing country. And according to German index of vulnerabilities, we are now the worst. We're not only one of the three, we're the most vulnerable. So if you are the most vulnerable, the developing countries are most vulnerable. Why shouldn't you participate? You're going to be devastated. Besides, even if you're a developing country and you throw all these poisonous gases to the atmosphere because you have no big industries, you have class, perhaps a small class, of people who burn carbon dioxide excessively, extravagantly, like the people in the developed countries. We're creating here a balloon of success. If any one of these or a group of the developing countries do not participate, there's going to be a hole in the balloon. Your balloon will collapse. So we must participate. If you put together our aggregate consumption, it's significant. It could be 10%, it could be 20%. The failure of 20% of humanity is a failure of humanity. The developing countries have to loosen up some more. They have the obligation to produce funds to buy their expensive technology. The technology is too expensive. It was China, a developing country, that brought down solar panel by almost 70%, and now the United States is suing China for dumping. They should talk among themselves and look out and craft a new rule of survival, like Noah created a craft of survival for flood. It's a new paradigm of approaching a survival problem of humanity. Lest we burn ourselves, we get reduced into the lifeless, beautiful marble that Venus is, a lifeless, beautiful marble in the galaxy.
Thank you. Howard, do you have a... Ralph, Howard, do you have one? Okay, Ralph, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. This comes down to the equity issue that Howard mentioned, and we're all in this together. But let me give you one example of where equity is sort of falling to place a bit. Morocco, in its INDC, has a target, I've forgotten what it is, 25% by 2030 reduction or whatever, but it's going to cost $45 billion to make that reduction, they estimated, and they'll only do it if they can get $35 billion from the Green Climate Fund that's just been set up in recent times, which is money from the developed countries being put into this fund in order to assist developing countries to reduce emissions and to adapt. It's got its $10 billion, it's capitalized and it's up and running, the Green Climate Fund. It's supposed to have $100 billion to get going, so there's some discrepancies there. But the Morocco example shows to me how equity can work to some degree, so there is some support coming from developed, going to developing, as there is in the Global Environment Facility that I work with, and through the World Bank and UNEP and UNDP, maybe $4 billion a year is going from developed to developing for climate change, biodiversity, water, etc. So there is some equity.
Yeah, so to summarize, because this problem affects everyone, and developing nations are vulnerable, and because we need each other in order to address it. I think we're the key points there. So we're going to take some questions from the mic now. I'll do 1 and 2, and then we'll throw those to the panel and then try and get through some more. So start here.
Okay, hello. Thank you for the opportunity. I would like to address my question to all of the speakers, including Kali as the energy leader. Basically, in futuristic hypothetical scenario where all targets have been met and the main goals achieved, what would be the following big challenge for the energy industry? And also, should we, as energy students, be covering something that we might be missing in order to avoid future governmental global meetings full of promises that many can't cope?
Okay. Sorry, it's a bit hard to hear up here, so I'm just going to repeat back what I think I heard. So the first question is, if all the targets were met and everything was what we had hoped, what's the next big challenge for the energy industry?
Yeah, that's it. And the second question is, should we as energy students be covering something that we might be missing in order to avoid future governmental meetings that are full of promises but that many countries just can't cope?
So should we which with the future meetings?
The thing is, should we as energy students be covering something that we might be missing now, like looking to, like digging in the future, in order to avoid other meetings like Paris and stuff, full of promises that maybe it's hard to keep and maintain?
Okay, so should we be learning things now?
Yeah.
Before, okay, so should the students today be learning things now to potentially avoid the need for these types of negotiations? Okay, over here.
Yes. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I want to address my question to the whole panel, especially to His Excellency, former President of the Maldives. I want to address a hugely neglected topic. It is the impacts of militarism on climate change. I am arguing that militarism in the form of the military-industrial complex is the biggest polluter and energy waster in the world. So, this is true in wartime and quite obvious with all the destructive activities that are happening there, but it's also true for peacetime, where weapons are produced and tested, there's exercise of militaries, there's establishment and maintenance of military bases,
so the question...
so on. The global military expenditure is about 1.5 trillion compared to the Green Climate Fund with 100 billion. This is extreme discrepancy, and if we could divest from the military, invest in green energy, this could change so much, so fast. So my question is, in short, why are the enormous negative impacts of militarism never addressed in any major environmental conference, and why is it not on the agenda in COP21?
Okay,
thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's start with that one since it was addressed to President Gayoom. So, there we go. So the question is...
I'm not quite clear about the question. I mean, what?
Yeah, so the question is militarism. So arming countries, going to war, is arguably one of the world's biggest energy wasters and CO2 producers. How come it's not on the agenda at the COP summits?
Well, I think the question is very relevant. Militarism or military expenditure means that a lot of funds and resources are wasted on things that are not helpful to the humankind. So I think it's very important that internationally, that we see things as they are. I mean, we want to do positive things, spend our money in a positive way that will make a positive change for humanity, rather than spending money on military objectives. We might spend money on education, on health, on environment protection, and that sort of thing. I think that is the idea that we have to agree on, that it is bad, it is negative to spend too much money on military objectives.
And why do you think it has been left off the agenda?
Well, I'm not quite clear why it's not on the agenda as such, but I think it's a very important topic.
Okay, great. Anyone else on militarism? Okay, we'll go to the other one. So if the negotiations were successful and we achieved the targets that we were looking to, what's the next big challenge for the energy industry? Tough one. Anyone? Okay, Howard?
Well, let me quickly say I don't know the answer. Maybe someone else does, but if we don't, then what that brings us back to, I think, is one of the themes of the last few days: innovation. That we can't see the future. We can project it, as people have done frequently here in the last few days. But when we project it, what we're really doing is looking back and assuming that in some way the future will look a little bit like the past. And yet time and again we see that the future confounds that idea, and it doesn't. So in everything we do, we need to be aware of the unpredictability of the future and therefore concentrate our energy, our activity on innovation, continuing to press that curve.
Okay, great. So the other question was around what students can learn and take with them to, I'm going to rephrase it a bit, but basically to have a different approach to these big challenges and potentially not have to go through the same issues we've gone through to date. Ralph, do you have any?
Well, to tie the 3 points together, really, I guess, I'm very pessimistic that the INDCs are going to be sufficient enough to meet the target that we need for 2 degrees. Howard might disagree, but you agree, sorry, you agree, yeah. So therefore, we can't just say, yes, it's all right, we're going to meet the target in Paris or maybe in 10 or 20 years' time. We've still got to work incredibly hard at the whole energy sector and indeed the land use sector and the military sector and everywhere else to drive these emissions down. So that's the first point there. We've actually got to get into negative emissions before the end of this century to meet the 2 degrees centigrade target. And think about that for research projects and all sorts of things that you might be working on in the next 30, 40, 50 years. Because it's not just a case of a bit of renewable energy and a bit of nuclear now. We need all the help we can get. Carbon dioxide capture and storage as well is a part of that. So in terms of the technologies that you should be learning about and what you should be learning is really that we haven't got the technologies yet. Technologies are advancing so rapidly that we don't know what the future is, but we hope that they're going to be fast enough to help drive down emissions. In my view, in 10, 20 years' time, nobody will want to own a car because it'll be a waste of time and a waste of money, and we can share cars, we can still have mobility, but we won't need a car. So think about that as a vision for the future, and that means that we could also therefore drive down emissions too. So the technologies are changing fast, but we don't know where they're taking us.
Great, thanks, Ralph. Michael, pigeonhole question. Many countries have failed to meet their target in the Kyoto Protocol. Why? And how is the road to Paris any different in that kind of outcome-based methods?
Well, the first question, it's obvious that the countries made targets that couldn't achieve because they were unrealistic. They didn't have technologies that could allow them to meet those emissions goals economically without sacrificing their growth. I agree with Howard that I think that there is more realism this time. But look, if a country violates its promise, no one's going to arrest the president of that country. It's not like the United Nations blue helmets are going to be sent in to arrest the government of China or something. I mean, this is an effort to kind of get everybody going in the same direction and also find opportunities where it's a win-win. I mean, there was this earlier question, which is why should poor and developing countries be involved in doing this? Well, they shouldn't if it's going to hurt their development, but they're not going to do that. So you don't really have to worry that much about that, because if they did do that, then they wouldn't be power anymore. The real issue is I think that governments are just grossly under-investing in their science and technology to accelerate these clean energy technologies. There's been way too much focus on what are emissions going to be in 2035, 2050? What are we going to promise to do when everybody's out of office and dead? And it's pointless. What matters is what your government are doing now, what your companies are doing right now to train science and technology, to get more engineers in the society, to be doing more as cross-border collaborations. So I've had any advice is be more impatient about those things and stop focusing on all this kind of hot air around future emissions and targets and promises and vows and all that.
Great, thank you. All right, 2 more questions from the mics, please. Start here.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Devashish. I'm from India and student at the National University of Singapore. I'd like Michael and, if possible, Professor Howe to answer my question. So this is regarding. The panel talked about the anti-dumping. We talked about the the businesses leading reduction in carbon emissions and negotiations not being binding, the economic value of all these things. So there's a direct relationship with the trade, right? And so WTO, even by its own standard, it's extremely slow, but it's glaring that there are no laws, there's no binding agreement in WTO on climate change. And with the Bali round just being, I mean, after India's consent, $1 trillion value to be unlocked, everyone is so pepped about the international trade. Based on that, don't you think, I mean, also Michael mentioned about the US-China, US-India agreement. So because it's not about just transferring the carbon emissions, it's about lowering the carbon emissions at a global level, right? So how do you put this linkage between the international trade, carbon emissions first, and do you see that the cause of carbon emissions would be done in good or harm if it is embedded into WTO, or is the regional trade agreement and free trade agreements are the way to go about it? Should I summarize it? I think it was a bit of a rant.
Yeah, the monitor up here is really bad. Can you just make it like a one-sentence question?
Okay, that was tough. Okay, so would you prefer that climate change negotiations are embedded into WTO or not?
No, sorry, a question. So what's the relationship between trade and climate?
No, not that. Would you want to embed climate change negotiations in WTO agreement? Or is RDA every other way to go about it?
Okay, that's one question. Here?
Just point straight to the point. I just wanted to ask, do you think using the world money could be put to more realistic investees to prevent climate change? So what I mean by that is, obviously, you've got developing countries who don't have the actual money to invest with their own new infrastructure. Wouldn't it be better for them to actually invest in reducing poverty, feeding the poor, treating disease, and improving education first, and then being able to further on invest in their own infrastructure? For instance, obviously, comparing this to developed countries already have passed that. They'd be given the money where now we've got education, we've got all this, now we can actually invest in solar panels and new technology. I'm not disregarding this completely, but I mean on a general consensus based.
Okay, so first question was directed at you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that what I would love to see is the top energy engineers and scientists from the biggest countries in the world, the top 10 and 20 countries in the world, getting together every year and making commitments and working together and doing stuff in the world. I think that's what matters, you know. So I think trying to get agreement with every country in the world is pointless. You know, 20 countries produce about 80% of global emissions, and really smaller countries just don't have the scientific and technical capacity that matters here. So I think what I would love to see is a forum for that. I don't think it should be around trade. I don't think this framing around emissions is even right. I just think it's got to be focused on technology, science and technology. This gets to your question. Look, countries for whom it's not in their national development interests to reduce emissions are not going to reduce their emissions. It's just really simple. So you don't have to worry too much about that. Big countries like India and China still have tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people that rely on wood and dung. And they also have incredible scientific and engineering classes. I mean, huge universities and scientific establishments. So they can walk and chew gum at the same time, as we say. And they should. They should be developing their scientific and technical capacity even as they're pursuing development. It's got to be both and. But again, it should really get much more focus on technology, technology, technology.
President Gayoom, you run a country. So in this question about where you prioritize in development and on then emission reduction, what are your thoughts? Should the developing nations be focused first on these kind of base level needs and then, you know, walk before they run and then start looking at the environment, or is there a way to do both at the same time? Yeah.
Well, I think it's important that we use renewable energy, solar energy, geothermal, wave energy, wind energy, whatever it is. But the point is that I think when this renewable energy is made available to the world, the whole world must use it. Not only certain countries and certain people and others don't use it. Because To give you an example, a country like Maldives, we have a population of only 350,000 people. Now, if you all use renewable energy in generating power, in driving cars, in our launches, in all aspects of our life, will that save us? It will not, because our carbon footprint is so small, it will not affect the world. If we do it, but other countries of the world don't adapt themselves and use renewable energy, that means that there will be no change in the global environment. There will be no change in the phenomenon of global warming and sea level rise and climate change. So my point is that whatever we agree on, or whatever new inventions or new sources of energy that are made available, must be used by everybody and must be made available to everybody in order to produce a result that is positive to our future.
Great. Ralph?
Yeah, there's a connection. This comes back to the co-benefits that I was talking about. So a country, if it plans and manages properly its strategy for the future, can get climate change mitigation and can get improved health because of local air pollution. There is a link with health and climate change through disease vectors coming through for dengue fever and mosquitoes and whatever, so that's a part of it as well. So you can't just prioritise. I think a government has got to look at all of these issues, but the key point is for different ministries, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Energy, to actually collaborate a lot closer than what happens in many countries at the moment.
Great. Howard?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I just want to build on what Ralph said in response to the question about trade and climate change and WTO processes. I think there's a big failure in the way governments work, which the President identified earlier, and that is that often an issue like climate change is confined within a government to a particular area. We know that climate change and its response moves to every sector of the economy. So integration within governments is absolutely crucial to effectively responding. And the sort of points Ralph made, I endorse entirely. And I think if you go into the international dimension of that, that means that in processes like the WTO and many others, the importance of climate change has to be recognised and reflected in negotiations and taken back home by delegations and integrated into government processes. That doesn't mean, of course, that the negotiations have to be replicated. That would be a disaster. But integration within government is the key to effective response, I think. Just on the second point about whether you can, are there ways in which you can continue to grow your economy and respond to climate change. Just to return to my conclusion in my remarks earlier, I think that is now well developed, and beyond the resources that I mentioned at that time, especially the new climate economy work from last year, I'd encourage people who are interested in participating, actually getting involved in this process around the world, to have a look at opportunities from the Global Green Growth Institute, which was a former a place I was at until a year ago. The Global Green Growth Institute based in Seoul, but Indonesia is a very important part of this institute. President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono is the president and the chairman. So it illustrates the ways in which countries are already finding pathways to development and sustainability, including effectively responding to climate change simultaneously.
This is interesting because what essentially everyone is saying is it's a bit compartmentalized, and that's not the way to actually approach it. These issues have effects in the system. Harrison, any comments on this?
We're not trying to create the perfect world. when we had problems with war, we went through fumbling step after another. We created the League of Nations. It was not good enough. We created the United Nations to stop the ravages of World War. The United Nations has been a very good instrument addressing many human problems of disease, poverty here, infestations of all sorts. But still, you find a lot of need to fill the gaps of the duties of the United Nations. Hopefully in the United Nations we'll be able to stem a world war. When you're addressing climate change, again, humanity is taking one big step forward to address the overheating of the earth. We'll be able to address this, take the fundamentals. It could be finance, technology, diplomatic solution. It has to be an overarching political solution. But that solution will stem the overheating of the earth, which is burning our life support system, enable us to continue to survive and be a wiser species. We cannot, just because the specialists bring out these many problems of poverty, eliminate in one blow with the solution to climate change, poverty, ignorance, disease. But we must focus on solving the problem of the overheating of the earth. And the growing consensus of humanity, the political minds and leadership, seem to be bringing us to that point. The students, when they go home, could strengthen that mindset of solving the overheating of the earth. Great. And I hope that from that building block, a new humanity will emerge, so that all the other problems of poverty, disease, and ignorance may subsequently be attended.
Great, thank you. All right, so I'm really sorry, guys, but we're out of time for questions. But I'm sure we can have a good discussion over the lunch break about these issues. But I do have one final lightning round question. So I've asked the panelists to prepare a one-sentence answer to the question, what is one way that students can get involved in the international climate negotiations? So this is kind of striking at the fact that we all have some power in this, and what can we as individuals do to participate? Harrison, what's one thing students can do?
That's the whole trouble. I want us to focus with an elephant gun on a big problem. But I don't want to oversimplify it with this one-word statement. I do not have that magic statement. We do not. It's a complex problem, and we should isolate this complex problem in this millennia. I think the scientists are saying we have about 36 years. In 2050, we must not allow the temperature to rise to 2 degrees centigrade. Oh, that's going to be a helpless endeavor. We will be like Sisyphus trying to bring down the temperature. I don't have a simple solution, but I pointed out to you externalities. Bring down the message of externalities. Let's price death of the 8 million that died in my home city of Tacloban. That is not price of carbon.
So
the deterioration of our life support system, of biodiversity, that is a price. Let's put that the price of carbon. The death of many species, put that in the rise of carbon. Humanity must do something about that in this coming 36 years.
So,
and let's stop this 400 billion subsidy. The students must march and tell them, let's stop this subsidy. And then, of course, Michael, advanced technology.
okay, so stop subsidies of fossil fuels, price externalities, and advanced technology. So get involved in one of those areas, students. All right, Michael.
maybe please change the conversation to technology, which is where the conversation belongs. Please, so we don't have to come back in 20 years and have the same conversation.
Ralph?
One sentence. Use the power of the social media for a virtual protest. I'm going to break the rules now,
I know,
Chair
you told me you were
Kelly.
going to break them in advance.
There's a challenge here. There's a challenge for student energy. Imagine when these negotiations are on in Paris in a few weeks' time, that everybody in this room and all the rest of the student energy community sent messages to all of their contacts and followers on Facebook and WhatsApp and said, please pass this message to all your contacts and followers, and then pass that to your contacts and followers. So there's millions of messages going out on one day, maybe December the 1st. And if the message behind that was something like this I've written down, we, the future generation, are deeply concerned at the future for our planet and call upon all climate change negotiators in Paris to agree a global carbon price and a binding agreement so that we can meet the 2 degrees centigrade target. Imagine the headlines around the world if student energy managed to crash the Facebook server by sheer millions. And there's power here for student energy.
Let's do it. All right. Challenge accepted, Ralph. Challenge accepted. Okay, Howard.
And with a short version for Twitter, please. All right?
Yeah, we'll shorten it to 140 characters for Twitter, Ralph.
That's a great idea. Mine is a bit narrower, and that is identify opportunities and tell your negotiators they can do much more than they think they can.
All right, talk to your negotiators. They can do more than they think they can. President Gayoom.
My one sentence would be learn, understand, share, reach out, be united, and speak with one voice. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Wonderful. So to summarize, I think what we've taken away here is that we can be perhaps cautiously optimistic about COP21 because for the first time in a long time, expectations are closer to reality, and we can push for a more integrated approach to these issues so that we can actually tackle them in our countries and then at global level. I just want to mention one thing. Student energy, for the first time ever, received UNFCCC observer status at the Climate Summit. Yeah! And we had a little bit of a meeting in the Innovation Jam last night about some ideas of what we could do to get that voice out, and now we have a new idea. So today, when you fill out the survey of how you might want to be involved with student energy, there's a box that says COP21 as one of the options. So if you're interested in being on a global volunteer team that helps to pull together our COP presence, please select that box and I will be in touch. With that, we're off to lunch and we're back here. It's going to be a short lunch because we're running behind. So we're back here at 1:30 for the Future Supply Mix panel. Thank you all so much. Thank you, panelists. You know this again. We're going to get everyone to hold these for a photo. Oh, just right up here. This is your part of the movement. Yes, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we'll see you next time. Definitely. Thanks. So good to have you here.
He's still cheering. That's exactly what you Mr. President, next.
No, thank you very much.
Very, very nice.
And it's the official Siemens Energy Instagram account. I don't know if you know Instagram. We have lots of pictures and you can follow that. But I guess we'll make sure you get that picture.
Attention to all delegates. Now we are going to have lunch until 1:30. I repeat once again, now we are going to have lunch until 1:30. And after that, we will have plenary session, features and the future of energy supply mix. And make sure that you won't miss the plenary session. And also, I'm going to inform you that you can get your certificate after the closing ceremony in the pre-function hall. Once again, I'm going to inform you that you can get your certificate after the closing ceremony in the pre-function hall. You can find your name in the certificate easily because you have put together the certificate in groups by the initial of your first name. Thank you.